Elena sits at the kitchen table. It is a Tuesday morning in late November. Her daughter has placed a cup of tea in front of her, still steaming, and Elena is watching the steam rise without reaching for it. She has not eaten in 4 days, not because she refuses, but because she sees no point. She explained it to her husband the night before in a voice that was calm, almost apologetic. She told him that her stomach had stopped working, that it had been some time since anything inside her was functioning. She told him quietly and without distress that she believed she was dead. Her husband thought it was a figure of speech, a dramatic expression of exhaustion. He told her to get some rest, but Elena did not mean it metaphorically. She was not describing depression, not reaching for language to approximate some emotional state. She meant it literally, completely, and with a certainty she found almost peaceful. Her heart, she felt sure, had stopped beating some weeks ago. Her blood had ceased to move. Her brain, she acknowledged, might still be generating thoughts. She wasn't certain how, but the rest of her had gone quiet. She was a body at a table, holding a cooling cup, waiting for nothing in particular. She had been like this for 3 weeks before anyone recognized what was happening, and what was happening had a name, one that physicians had known about for over a century and that still, today, strikes most people as too strange to be real. Cotard's delusion was first formally described in 1880 by the French neurologist Jules Cotard, who called it le délire de négation, the delirium of negation. He documented a patient who denied the existence of parts of her body, believed she had no need for food, and ultimately concluded she had no soul and could not die because she was, in her own assessment, already dead. Cotard recognized immediately that this was something distinct, not ordinary depression, not psychosis in the conventional sense. It was a collapse of the patient's felt sense of existence. The condition is classified today within the broader category of delusional disorders, though it most commonly arises as a feature of severe depression, schizophrenia, or as a consequence of neurological injury. It is extraordinarily rare. Estimates suggest that fewer than a few hundred documented cases appear in the global medical literature, though the number is almost certainly an undercount. Many patients are misdiagnosed or never reach clinical attention at all. The presentation varies. Some patients, like Elena, believe their internal organs have stopped functioning. Others deny that their body exists at all. Some believe they are decomposing. A smaller subset develops what researchers call the paradoxical grandiose variant, in which the patient, rather than believing they are nothing, comes to believe they are immortal or eternal. One documented patient believed he could not die and therefore saw no danger in testing that belief repeatedly. Both poles, the nihilistic and the grandiose, emerge from the same broken mechanism. What makes Cotard's delusion particularly resistant to treatment is the nature of the delusion itself. You cannot argue someone out of it. If a doctor shows Elena her own heartbeat on a monitor, Elena does not revise her belief. She incorporates the evidence into her delusion. The machine must be wrong, or perhaps dead people's hearts can still produce signals. The belief is sealed from the inside, impervious to external correction. And Elena, quiet and cooperative at the kitchen table, had been living inside that sealed world for nearly a month before her daughter made the call that would eventually bring her to a psychiatric unit. Before all of this, Elena was a secondary school art teacher in a mid-sized city in the north of England. She had taught for 19 years. Her students described her in the aggregate as demanding and fair, someone who remembered their names years later, who kept student work pinned to her own walls long after the students had moved on. She had a tendency to over-explain things she found beautiful. She would stop mid-lesson to talk about negative space, about how the absence of something could define the thing itself. Her students didn't always follow her, but they felt her conviction. She lived with her husband, Paul, and their 2 adult children visited on weekends when they could. The house was full of things she had collected without quite meaning to. Bowls from a market in Portugal, a clock that ran 5 minutes fast, a cat named Berwick, who slept on the radiator. She gardened badly and enthusiastically. She had strong opinions about film and almost no opinions about food. She slept well. She laughed easily. She had a history of depressive episodes. two significant ones in her 30s, both treated with medication and resolved within months. Her psychiatrist at the time had noted a tendency toward what he described as existential rumination, a habit of sitting with large unanswerable questions longer than was comfortable. Elena had always been somewhat amused by that phrasing. She thought sitting with questions was just thinking. She didn't see it as a symptom. The autumn before her hospitalization had been difficult in ordinary ways. A difficult cohort of students, a dispute with her department head. Paul's mother had died in September, and the grief in the house was real and present. Elena had been sleeping less. She had withdrawn from the small social rituals she usually maintained, but none of it seemed alarming. Not to her, not to Paul, not to the friends who noticed she was quieter than usual. These things happen. Autumn happens. She would come back, as she always had. The first thing Elena described later was a feeling of distance. Not sadness exactly. She had been sad before, and this was different. It was more like a gap had opened between herself and the world she was observing. She watched Paul make dinner, and it looked correct. His hands, the pan, the kitchen light. But it felt like watching it through glass. She knew these things were real. She simply couldn't feel their reality. This phenomenon has a clinical name: derealization. It is the experience of the external world feeling unreal, dreamlike, or remote. It is not uncommon as an accompaniment to severe depression or anxiety, and on its own it is distressing, but not immediately alarming. Elena did not mention it to Paul because she assumed it would pass. She had a talent, as she later acknowledged, for assuming things would pass. Over the following 2 weeks, the distance deepened. It turned inward. She began to feel that it wasn't just the world that felt remote. It was herself. She would look at her hands and recognize them without feeling they belonged to her. She would catch her reflection and experience a split second of confusion before recognition arrived. Late, effortful, unconvincing. This second phenomenon also has a name: depersonalization. The felt sense of being oneself, of inhabiting a body that is continuous and real, was coming apart quietly, without drama. Then, sometime in the 3rd week of October, something shifted. The derealization and depersonalization had been unsettling but abstract. What replaced them was concrete. Elena woke one morning and lay still in the dark and arrived at a conclusion that felt, in her own description, like something settling into place. She felt certain her heart had stopped beating during the night. She pressed her fingers to her wrist. She could not find a pulse, or rather, she found something, but it did not register to her as evidence of life. She felt no alarm about this. She felt instead a kind of recognition, as if something she had almost known for weeks had finally become clear. She got up. She made tea. She did not tell Paul. In the weeks that followed, the delusion structured itself with a logic that was, within its own terms, almost coherent. Elena stopped eating because she could see no biological reason to do so. She had explained to herself that whatever processes depended on food had ceased. She was not hungry, or rather, she was aware of a sensation in her body that might once have been hunger, but she no longer interpreted it as a signal requiring response. Her body, she believed, was running on something else, perhaps on inertia, perhaps simply winding down. She continued to move through the house. She answered questions when asked. She was not agitated. Paul described her in those weeks as very far away, present in the room but not reachable. She agreed to go on short walks with him, and she would look at things he pointed out: a dog, frost on the grass, the neighbor's lights, with a polite attention that seemed to him increasingly like performance. She was there. She was not there. She stopped going to school after the 2nd week. She told Paul she was unwell, which was the most accurate thing she said during that period. Paul arranged for a substitute and did not push her. Grief about his mother was still moving through the house, and he was navigating his own interior weather. He noticed she wasn't eating properly. He noticed she seemed not to sleep. He noticed these things individually, over days, and did not yet see them as a pattern. It was their daughter, Claire, visiting on a weekend in November, who recognized that something had moved beyond ordinary depression. She found Elena in the garden in the cold without a coat, standing still, looking at the bare soil of the flower beds. When Claire brought her inside and sat with her, Elena told her, clearly and without apparent distress, that she had been dead for some weeks now. She described it in terms that were explanatory rather than frightening. She wasn't asking for help. She was, in some sense, just informing Claire of the situation. Claire called Elena's GP that evening. Within 48 hours, Elena had been assessed by a crisis psychiatric team. The admitting psychiatrist noted her low body weight, her affect, described as flat and distant but not hostile, and the systematized nature of her delusion. She was admitted voluntarily, though she expressed some puzzlement about the point of treatment. "You cannot treat someone who is already dead," she said. She did not say it with cruelty. She said it the way someone might note a logical inconsistency in a plan. To understand what happened to Elena, it helps to understand what the brain normally does, invisibly, continuously, to produce the felt sense of being alive. Neuroscientists describe a process sometimes called interoceptive inference, the brain's ongoing interpretation of signals from the body, heartbeat, breath, temperature, pain, hunger, into a coherent representation of the self as a living entity. This process is largely automatic. You do not decide to feel alive. Your brain constructs that feeling, constantly, from an enormous volume of incoming data, and under normal circumstances, the construction is seamless and invisible. In Cotard's Delusion, something in that construction fails. Current research points to dysfunction in regions including the anterior insula, which processes bodily signals and integrates them with emotional meaning, and the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in self-referential processing. When Elena pressed her fingers to her wrist and could not feel her own pulse as evidence of life, it was not a sensory failure. She could detect the sensation. What had broken was the process that assigns meaning to that sensation, that connects physical signal to felt existence. This same mechanism explains why argument is ineffective. The delusion does not arise from a reasoning error. It arises from a perceptual one, a failure at the level of felt experience before cognition even engages. Presenting Elena with a functioning heart monitor does not repair the disconnect between her body's signals and the emotional weight those signals are supposed to carry. She can see the readout. She cannot feel what it means. The belief fills the gap where feeling should be. Functional imaging in documented Cotard's cases has shown dramatically reduced metabolic activity across wide areas of the brain, in some cases resembling patterns seen in states of anesthesia or certain vegetative conditions. The brain, in effect, has partially stopped registering itself as active. Elena's belief was not purely delusion in the dismissive sense. In some measurable way, the brain generating that belief had gone quiet in a manner that had no precedent in her experience. She was describing, inaccurately, but not entirely irrationally, something real that was happening to her. Elena was hospitalized for 11 weeks. Her treatment combined electroconvulsive therapy, which has shown the strongest evidence base for Cotard's delusion specifically, with antidepressant medication and structured psychiatric support. She tolerated the treatment without resistance, though she described the early sessions as curious rather than meaningful. She did not expect them to work, for reasons she considered obvious. The shift, when it came, was gradual. It was not a single moment of recognition. Over several weeks, the certainty of the delusion softened. Not all at once, but in the way that fog thins rather than lifts. She began, tentatively, to acknowledge that she might be wrong. She began to eat. The metabolic activity in her brain, measured at intervals, climbed slowly toward baseline. She was discharged in February. She did not return to teaching that academic year. She lived quietly, attending outpatient appointments, relearning a relationship with her own body that she described as fragile and requiring attention. She was, by most measures, recovered. The delusion had resolved. Her mood had stabilized. Her weight had returned. But she told her psychiatrist near the end of her outpatient treatment that she did not think she would ever be entirely casual about being alive again. That felt, in the context of everything, less like a symptom and more like a reasonable conclusion. Cotard's delusion has a variable prognosis. Some patients recover fully, some relapse. A smaller number remain chronically ill, particularly those whose delusion is embedded in an underlying schizophrenia spectrum disorder. Elena's case, rooted in severe depression and neurological disruption, placed her in a category where recovery was possible and where it occurred. She was fortunate in that respect. The disorder does not always cooperate with outcomes. What Cotard's delusion asks of us, ultimately, is a question about the nature of certainty. Elena knew she was dead. She knew it the way you know where you are standing, the way you know your own name. The belief was not chosen, and it was not performed. It was the output of a brain that had lost the ability to confirm to itself that it was alive. And in the absence of that confirmation, it generated the only conclusion that fit the available evidence. We tend to think of sanity as a stable platform, something we either have or don't. Elena's case suggests something more unsettling, that the felt sense of existing is a construction, assembled moment to moment by systems we never observe and cannot voluntarily control. Most of us will never know how much work those systems are doing. We simply wake up and assume we are real. For Elena, for 11 weeks, that assumption failed, and the mind, rather than collapse into chaos, did what minds do. It made sense of what it had. It built a story. The story was wrong, but it was the only one available to her. That, perhaps, is the most unsettling thing of all. If you like unsettling psychology, like and subscribe for a new diagnosis each week.